Hi, and welcome to this webinar on Terminal Emulation Security. My name is Christian Rule, and I'm the Director of Business Transformation at Flynet. I'm going to be presenting some of the issues and some of the solutions that should be considered when considering the modern threat landscape and your terminal emulation solution. I'll be joined later on by my good friend and colleague, Mark Bain, who is Director of Technology at Flynet. Mark will be walking you through a practical demonstration of some of the solutions to these issues that we'll talk about in the presentation. So, a quick overview of what we'll cover today. I'll start with a brief description of who Flynet are. We'll then take a few minutes to remind ourselves that the cyber threat is real and that attacks of this nature happen to organizations like ours. I'll then give you some insight into the do's and don'ts with your own terminal emulators. Moreover, how your terminal emulation choice can dramatically impact your exposure to current cybersecurity threats. Mark will then provide us with a practical show and tell, and then time permitting, we can take some questions at the end. At any time, if you have a question, please type it into the question window and one of the moderators will present it on your behalf. So, Flynet's been around for roughly 25 years, working in the mainframe, I-series and Unix application space for that period. Flynet was historically an academic science company, tackling science barriers for companies like IBM and Xerox, helping them overcome challenges related to physics and similar fire meets water issues that are encountered when deploying technologies like mainframe and I-series to their customers. Our core technology offering was actually developed for and with IBM for one of their largest global customers over 20 years ago. On that journey, Flynet accrued more and more customers, either via large technology vendors like the ones I've mentioned, or via word of mouth. Flynet didn't actually advertise until around 2015, when for all intents and purposes, the science company had become a software company without even realizing it. And you can see here just some of Flynet's partners and customers. Lots of brands I'm sure you'll recognize, even the UN is a customer of Flynet's. For this presentation, I've chosen to focus on just the recent past, because according to virtually every source of data with an interest in the SIEM or cybersecurity community, all agree that the number of breaches is growing exponentially. But I think it's fair to say to those who are familiar with the term that danger is close, my friends. I'll share some data from our colleagues over at Symantec, Checkpoint and Guardicore. 22 billion records compromised in 2020 alone. 22 billion. Whilst they aren't all identity related records, there is still 3 files for every person on the planet. Checkpoint claimed that the number of threats grew 7 times in 2020. This included a 50% jump in Q3 alone. Some large dominoes. Some noteworthy breaches in 2020. This gives us a little reminder of some notable names that have fallen foul to the cyber threat. Travelex was one of the most well-known currency conversion agencies. They went down to ransomware on the 1st of January 2020, with knock-ons to a number of other high street stores that white-labeled the Travelex service. Just some of those include Asda, Walmart, Sainsbury and Tesco. Initially, the attackers asked for $6 million. Travelex, fair play to them, held out for some time before eventually paying $2.3 million to restore their remaining services. But 8 weeks of disruption had passed and their business was all but destroyed. This led to Travelex going into administration in August last year. Luckily for some of their creditors, though, they have been revived with a new consortia purchasing them back out of a pre-packed deal. Marriott, I bring these guys up as they've had so many breaches over the last few years that even the fines for the breaches must be having a significant impact on their balance sheet. I have no doubt that after every breach, the tech guys at Marriott seal up that particular hole for good. Unfortunately, however, the attackers are relentless and polymorphic. Last year, a hacker managed to obtain 2 legitimate logins from a franchise Marriott property and then went on to liberate over 5 million guest profiles from the Marriott central back office mainframe. In fairness, this does seem small compared to their 500 million guest account breach in 2018. But my point here is don't expect to get bitten once. Ask yourself, how many times have you caught a cold in your lifetime? The same is becoming true here. The more and more we live closer to the digital super hub, the more and more we will continually be exposed to these threats. In fairness, I could do this all day. But if just still focusing on 2020, EasyJet, 9 million customer records hacked. Brenntag paid 4.4 million to de-ransom or decrypt their files. Colonial Pipeline paid over $4 million. You remember Colonial Pipeline? It was all over the news. It was the one with the folks queuing at gas stations across the USA. CWT Global, again, a similar amount of dollars. Estee Lauder, Citrix, LG, Xerox. For every one of these household names, there are thousands of businesses you've never heard of getting hit. To be honest, I could keep going and going with these names, but I won't, because I want to talk about SolarWinds. Let's call it the SolarWinds incident, because calling it an attack almost undermines its nefariousness. Moreover, the patience and guile that the attackers adopted. It's also commonly thought of to be the single largest breach in corporate history thus far. So for those of you that don't know, SolarWinds is a network and IT performance and monitoring software vendor. And at some point in 2019, what is believed to be an initial state level actor, many have accused the Russian intelligence services, but I couldn't really comment, of course. Anyway, they injected a backdoor into the SolarWinds Orion application. Then by natural client updating, this went on to infect 18,000 organizations, allowing the attackers direct access to network and back-end systems around the globe. Some examples of organizations hit include the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Energy, and 425 companies from the top Fortune 500. Need I go on? The nature of the host software gave the perpetrators deep and sustained access to systems inside firewalls, where we normally believe our goods and software and systems are safe. The true cost of the attack we may never know, but it's ongoing, with new breaches still trickling out of it today. It is also believed that whilst the initial breach festered without detection, the broader dark web community became aware of the penetration. Excited by a new opportunity, a second state actor then used the same backdoor to also inject an additional breach point of their own. So the story is just about as bad as it could be. Trust me when I say that none of these victims lived happily ever after. I wanted to talk about SolarWinds. It's a very public example of state-level actors disrupting and infecting even the mundane, not sensational, but with deep penetrations, with extensive dwell times, not clearly for immediate financial gains. Normally perpetrated by so-called advanced and persistent attack groups, or APT groups for short. They're organized, often state-backed. They'll target operations through a variety of attack vectors over a sustained period of time, often with a seemingly banal data gathering remit that can then be weaponized later at some time in the future by a benefactor of their choosing. So, discrete state level agendas and targets of opportunity are being collected in our backyards all the time. So please don't make things easier for these folks. For those of you that may be interested, take some time and Google the Lazarus Group. They are a known APT group. Lazarus Group are in fact North Korea's own private cyber army. One of their more notable campaigns is known as the Bangladesh bank heist. It's truly interesting stuff. The BBC even serialized a podcast about it for those that are curious. I believe it's on the iPlayer still. So what have we established so far? That attacks are happening all the time, but it's not just one type of attack. I've grabbed a small list here just to demonstrate that this is an industrialized process. Ransomware alone is an industry on its own, currently worth $10 billion a year, and it doubles year on year. I'm not going to talk about all of these, but I'll pick up on a few of what I like to call cheeky ones. And I'll start with cloud crypto mining. So for those not familiar with cryptocurrency, essentially they're extremely complex algorithms that produce valid checksums. Each valid checksum is essentially a crypto coin. Anyone can mine for a given crypto, but it takes a huge amount of processing power to do it economically. So as the uptake of corporate clouds expand, it's not always easy to know exactly how much of the rented cloud compute power is actually being used by your organization, or how much might be being discreetly borrowed by a cryptojacker. A big victim of this was Mr. Crypto himself. I kind of laughingly say that because he's so very vested in cryptocurrency. But Elon Musk in 2018, Tesla's cloud got hacked and some of their compute power was stolen for exactly this purpose. We can stay with Elon for a moment and move to my next choice, insider threats. In 2018, which is proving not to be a good year for Elon, Tesla filed a suit against an employee for leaking a number of important manufacturing documents to unknown third parties. I would assume in this case the motivation was financial, but it can be competition. It can also be a weaponized contractor or trusted third party. So we always think we can trust our own staff, but it's often a pseudo insider, a trusted third party that is the source of an internal breach. The tremendous growth of remote work, largely due to the pandemic, makes this even more of a clear and present danger, as the physical perimeter fence around the corporate network loses its power and the familiar faces we trust on a day-to-day basis become more faceless. We can stay with remote work and use it as a nice link as we talk about shadow IT. Shadow IT used to mean something else. It used to mean another technology center in an organization that basically acted like their own skunk works, often throwing the organization IT policy out of the window for expediency or just because they could. In this list, however, though, shadow IT takes on a different veneer. With more and more folk working from home, there are more opportunities for individual staff members to make technological choices that aren't completely aligned with the company policy or normal corporate desktop. An example could be the various productivity apps that any user may use to make their daily life a little easier. A lot of folks have struggled through the pandemic using groupware tools like Microsoft Teams. However, if a user experienced any persistent annoyance or lack of continuity of service, this would very quickly lead the individual to defect to maybe a personal version of Zoom or maybe even Google Hangouts. I don't want to offend anyone, so I'll say obviously that other groupware tools are available than the ones I've mentioned. But the user defects to obtain a better user experience, but would then start sharing files and corporate sensitive data on what is essentially a public platform. Which speaks to our good friends over at Gartner, who estimate that a third of all current cyber attacks start initially with a shadow IT incursion. Finally, before moving on to what we should be doing to close some of the open doors around terminal emulation, I'll briefly talk about zero-day exploits. For those not familiar with the term, a zero-day exploit is centered on exposing a vulnerability in a newly launched application or application update. Various APD groups, the guys we were just talking about, hawkishly wait around for major releases for broad use products from companies like Microsoft or Apple or Google to scan the new code, find a weakness, and then piggyback that update into a wide user base for further penetration and later exploitation. I always personally wait a few days to install an update for my iPhone. And similarly, I do the similar thing with Microsoft products. I always wait for R2. This approach has served me quite well thus far, and I have avoided some bumps doing it. 4 do's and 4 don'ts in regards to security and terminal emulation. Don't number 1, do not use a terminal emulator that runs in a Java applet, or more specifically uses the Java Virtual Machine or JVM, as it's more widely known. This is a bit of an obvious one, really. We all remember the constant security updates our little coffee cup icon used to receive. It was a daily update. The JVM had more holes in it than a Tetley tea bag. And for the non-tea drinkers among you, a Tetley tea bag's got over 1,000 holes in it. The security maintenance of the JVM proved to be far too much of a burden for Oracle, who owned it at the time. So they deprecated the web browser JVM in 2017, and then subsequently the desktop JVM in 2019. So neither of those have received an update in years. If you're running an emulator like this, you are literally inviting cyber criminals around to stay in your organization. Always ask yourself, if the source of a cyber breach was something that I was in charge of, what's going to happen to me next? Number 2, do not use terminal emulators that use Microsoft ActiveX controls. The story here is very similar to Oracle with the JVM. Microsoft, in their wisdom, deprecated this ages ago, along with support and security updates. Do not use an emulator that ties you to an old operating system. There are a lot of vendors that have taken an age to produce a Windows 10 compliant version of the terminal emulation client. I meet organizations all the time that have grown tired of waiting for their emulator vendor to get moving to Windows 10 and have, for security compliance, had to draw a line in the sand and been forced to change vendor in the end. Have you ever wondered, though, why it took so long for some of these vendors to upgrade their products? It's because none of them have actually done any significant work on their desktop terminal emulator products for over 20 years. And in most cases, you're running an application that was actually designed for Windows XP. Then it was bent into an XP container to run in Windows 7. And now, well, you guessed it, it's been badly ported over to Windows 10. I would actually go further than that. because guess what? Windows 10 has already been deprecated. It's already got a deprecation date in 2025. I would say avoid using, and on that basis, I would say avoid using any software that is tied to a desktop operating system or some kind of container dependency. In the world of remote and hybrid work, local desktops are just a risk, really. It's a technological risk you don't even need or have to accept. Do not use an emulator that doesn't receive regular security updates. This is kind of naughty to put in the list, if I'm honest, because mentioned security updates to most legacy vendors and tumbleweed comes rolling past. I remember I did a presentation a couple of years ago. I think I looked at IBM PCOM, and it had received 3 updates in the last 15 years. These applications are pretty much just cash cows for the vendors. They haven't had to put any work into them for years, but they carry on charging support, happily taking your money. Anyway, enough cynicism. Let's move more positively to the do's list. Moving to a centralized solution is a good first step. Even if it's Citrix or some other VDI solution, the fact that it's centralized with all the operating system patching and any security being maintained in one place, this is a far better solution than rogue, unmaintained, user-based endpoints. Having said that, it's quite obvious that virtual desktops isn't the most efficient way of doing it. And it won't be long before the billions of video threads generated by virtual desktop traffic is thought of with similar negative connotations as plastic contamination in the ocean. So with this in mind, if you find yourself considering a centralized Web 2.0 optimized solution, then you're probably already onto a winner. All the benefits of the centralized maintenance and security, coupled with hopefully a relatively modern architecture to the application stack, providing you with that extra security and optimum network performance that you need, which will greatly improve the security and also reduce your remote user defection rate. Number 2, it only allows connections to the host that are secured over TLS. Some people are hopefully sitting there just nodding, saying this is obvious. But I still turn up many organizations for desktop emulator replacement projects to find that the user base, admittedly often within the corporate network, are nonetheless very exposed, connecting directly to the mainframe or host application with plain text telnet. This basically means that all their key presses, including their logins and passwords, can be read very easily as it passes across the LAN and WAN as just plain text. Remember what I said about the SolarWinds? APTs, those guys, those big groups, those often state-backed groups? Well, they'll get inside, remember, and just listen. They're gathering that information, and then they act at a later date. So plain text telnet is literally worse than turning up to school with your trousers and pants on, with no trousers and pants on. A breach due to this error will probably be an indelible mark on your CV that you may never erase. So just don't do it. Whitelisting. If you're on a centralized solution, then this is a pretty easy win. At home, you only allow people into your house that you specifically invite in. The same should be true for your mainframe or host application. I will concede, though, that it's more challenging if you still have thousands of desktop-style user endpoints, but it is still doable. That said, if it's in your gift, you can make it easier for yourself, maybe consider that move to a centralized solution. Only use vendors that have red team credentials. This is an interesting one because if you ask that question of your terminal emulation vendor, you will no doubt expose that they've never even submitted themselves to a third-party penetration test, let alone have an awareness of coding standards that are security aware and compliant. So it goes without saying that most legacy emulation vendors do not respond well here. Their view is mainly driven by 2 very naive and out-of-touch misconceptions. 1, that their emulator will always be used inside a corporate firewall, and 2, that threats haven't evolved since Microsoft Word macro viruses of the late 90s. So if you dare, ask about penetration. And if you're braver still, maybe ask about coding standards like ISO 5055. At the bottom of the screen, there's a little thought to ponder. It says, always remember that the terminal emulator is a direct connection to your host, to your most critical business system. Think of it this way. When you go on vacation, do you leave your partner's jewelry or watches on the dressing room table or the key to your car in the hallway? No, you don't. You lock them safely away. The same should be true with your highly valuable business critical system. So security is the new agile. I say this because it's not all doom and gloom. This is a great opportunity to review your situation, increase your security, increase business system accessibility, increase your users' productivity, and reduce your support burden. So it can be a real win-win if done correctly. If we focus on that modern centralized solution that I've just talked about, commonly they are more than likely web browser-based solutions and can utilize modern identity management and security technologies. With that in mind, let's start with authentication and federated identity solutions. So at the front door, what's going to happen? If it's on a corporate LAN, then you might just be prompted to enter your host system name and password like you've always done. However, if your users are traversing public infrastructure, you'll want to consider multi-factor authentication. This could be using a number of standards. Try to make sure your vendor supports the open standards like OAuth or SAML. Standards like OpenID are proprietary, and guess what? They can get deprecated. There is a good chance your organization already has some web accessed application. And in that case, you're just adding another app to the already protected multi-factor stack, increasing the accessibility and usability and reducing your swivel chair IT. Authorization. So what team or what technology governs host application access, or what level of application access a user will have when they're logged in? In fairness, in most scenarios that I encounter, the host or legacy application owner or team are managing that within the application itself, and that can remain the same going forward. However, you may choose to review that at some point in the future and create domain-based profiles or use LDAP authorities or groups. With that in mind, you want to make sure that your vendor has an open approach or can facilitate that. Active Directory integration is a great start, but I almost prefer a solid LDAP API. Therefore, you can log into pretty much any and use any off-the-shelf LDAP compliant authentication solution. Single sign-on. It could be the ease of adding the solution to the existing stack, or at least knowing the new vendor application can function with off-the-shelf SSO solutions or password vaults like Okta, Keeper, OneLogin, etc. If you don't have any of the aforementioned, this could be an opportunity to add single sign-on to your host. And this can be done as simple as using a synchronized encrypted table with your new emulator. Definitely a question for your new prospective terminal emulation vendor. Whitelisting on your mainframe, AS400 or Unix system. This is a great opportunity to better protect your host system. Going forward, we know that any 5250, 3270 or VT, XXX, 100, 320, 220, 340, etc. connections are going to come from the new terminal emulator vendor's web server or application server. So with this in mind, we can restrict access to that IP address alone, offering a great degree of microsegmentation straight out of the gate. Similarly, we could do the same with the terminal emulation web server, hardening the solution still. So what does an ideal setup look like? In practice, you can see here we've added a small web server in between the end user and the host system. In this case, it's Flynet web server, but equally, it could be another vendor. The principles are the same. The Flynet server actually connects to the host system via Telnet or Telnet over SSL, TLS, or SSH. All of your client sessions will actually be intercepted here and converted into HTML on the fly. A single small virtual machine can support thousands of concurrent connections. Each session is only about 50 kilobytes inside, hence the thousands. If you need tens of thousands of concurrent connections, you simply load balance in a few more VMs. But you'll notice a big difference between a couple of thousand users on one virtual machine rather than just the 30 users you can get on a Citrix virtual machine. Far more scalable, cost effective, and in a way that provides a service that's native to the internet. From a user's desktop, tablet, or mobile device's web browser, you can securely access your terminal session. Any interruptions to the connection or bad network coverage, Wi-Fi dropouts, for example, are irrelevant because you're essentially accessing a secure, keyword stateless web page. Your terminal session is safe on our server, protected from the inconsistencies of the internet, allowing you to seamlessly reconnect to the same terminal session anytime. In this scenario, you may never notice that an interruption actually occurred. No more dropped connections for your users. This method of key business system access is agile. You can connect to it from any device without any proprietary software or plugins, and you can do this from any location, office or remote. It's secure, using the latest banking level security, and it's performant, many times faster than traditional desktop terminal emulation. Just to add some context to the practical demonstration you're about to see, you'll see here Flynet essentially have a core terminal emulation server. And on top of that, we run our pure web terminal emulation solution. So that's pure HTML, no plugins or applets, no client-side software. A separate product in the suite, the user experience application, allows you to build modern responsive interfaces onto the older green screen interface. Additionally, the web service application allows you to create RESTful or SOAP web services directly to the application functionality in the green screens themselves. Finally, there you'll see the Flynet Viewer Studio. This is a no-code and low-code IDE that allows you to build those UXs and web services I've just talked about. But to avoid confusion, I will say that Flynet Viewer Terminal Emulator is a full-featured premium enterprise-level emulation solution that just works out of the box. It takes about 15 minutes to install on a server, and then you can practically deploy it to thousands of users straight away by emailing out a link to the TE server. Just to create some deployment context for you, a typical on-premise architecture might look like this. You can see all of your typical network architecture here, components, firewalls, DMZs, various switches. Flynet's a first-class web citizen, so it won't be broken or slowed down by any architecture that's sat in front of it or used to harden your environment. Flynet is essentially just a sophisticated website, so you can load balance it and secure it in the same way that you would harden any website or web application. We can see it here in a cloud setting. A lot of organizations have cloud destinations in their strategy, or even more simply software-defined data centers. Flynet, again, is a web native comfortably sitting in any setting. Flynet is partnered with the 3 largest enterprise cloud providers. You can hydrate a Flynet server in Azure, Oracle, and AWS. It's available in the various marketplaces. At this point, I think it's probably a good juncture to hand over to my colleague, Mark, who will be giving you a quick technical look at some of the things we've talked about today. Any questions for me again, just about the things I've talked about, type them into the question window and one of the moderators will present them for you at the end.
Thanks, Chris. I will now share my screen. Okay, so today we're going to go on a journey, a practical journey of what it looks like to offer a secure terminal emulation over public infrastructure. So I'm going to start with the web browser here, and I am going to go to the public URL of the terminal. But the first thing that it does is it bounces me to my federated identity provider. In this case, it's Microsoft Azure Microsoft Azure directory, and it's using SAML2, but it could be OpenID, it could be OAuth, etc. So in this case, before I can even access the terminal emulation, I have to authenticate first. So I'm going to go ahead and enter my credentials. So this is my Azure credentials. So here in our Azure configuration, we have multi-factor authentication. So it's asking me to open my mobile device and authorize my connection and approve it. So I'm going to hit approve on my cell phone, and there we are. It's authenticated. So at this stage, we're also doing authorization. The identity provider, in this case, the Azure SAML2, specifies whether or not this particular user is allowed to access this resource. So, and in this case, clearly I was. So I've got the authentication and the authorization happening through that part. But here you can see in this particular setup, I still have to authorize against the mainframe. So I still have to enter my username and password before I can access the mainframe resource. But as Chris said, Flynet does do a number of single sign-on solutions as well. So you can actually bypass that step if you want, but you still have the authentication and authorization by your federated identity sitting in front before you can actually access the service. So if you look at the browser here, you can see it's a standard browser, but you can see that we are using HTTPS. So the communication between the browser and the Flynet server is encrypted. This is the normal kind of encryption you use to access your banks, etc. And this is very secure. It also not only is encryption, but it's certification. So you can tell that who you are connecting to. So not only is there an encryption, but you can make sure that you are connecting to the valid system, and there's no what's called a man-in-the-middle attack trying to siphon off your key presses. They are validating that you are connecting to the system. So there is encryption between your desktop or your mobile device and the Flynet Viewer server. There is validation of that you're connecting to the correct server through certificates, and of course you've got your federated identity sitting in front, which is doing your authentication and authorization to actually use the service. So sort of the left-hand side of the equation is very secure, authenticated, and authorized and encrypted. So then there is the right-hand side of the equation. There's the communication between the Flynet viewer server and your mainframe, iSeries, Unix, VMS, that kind of system there. So there are a number of ways that Flynet can achieve that. So when you're connecting to mainframe or iSeries, you tend to use TLS connectivity, and this encrypts. Creates a encrypted tunnel, which Telnet then travels through. So again, with the TLS in Flynet, not only does it encrypt the data, but you can also do two-way validation of who is connecting and who you're connecting to. So again, just like the web browser, there may be encryption, but you can also validate the server. So you as a client, in this case, a Flynet viewer server, can make sure that it's connecting to the right mainframe, and it should trust a mainframe. After all, you could be about to enter your password into the mainframe. You've got to make sure that you're not connecting to a less than scrupulous mainframe at the other end. But it also works the other way around. Flynet Viewer can provide a certificate, a client certificate to the mainframe to say, I am actually a valid user of the mainframe services. So it can be very good on the right-hand side of the equation when it comes to security, encryption, authentication, authorization. You've got your encryption, you've got your service certificate, you've got your client certificates. Also on top of this, if you are using say a Unix system, Flynet Viewer also gives you the ability to use SSH, which is actually replaces Telnet completely, but uses encryption and again, authorization through passwords and certificates, etc. So what you're left with is encryption end to end. There is multiple stages of authentication and authorization. And there's also validation of the connection chain. Who are you connecting to as a browser and who Flynet Viewer is connecting to as a host system. On top of this, if you look at the slide which Chris showed earlier, so this is a typical deployment of any corporate website to public infrastructure. You have your DMZ here, load balancers with your Flynet Viewer server behind it there. So the connectivity for the external users is normal web traffic. It's encrypted web traffic, but it's just the HTTPS that you're used to, or secure WebSockets, which is like a long-lasting HTTPS connection. But all of this is just normal web traffic, which means that you can, inside your DMZ, inside your firewalls, you can use intelligent inspection of the data traveling through the system. So you can do such things as look for unusual behavior. You can look for badly formed packets that might be coming in, web packets that might be trying to be used to circumnavigate your authentication and authorization system. And also you can look for things like brute force attacks and things like that. So the kind of security you can apply to a web session is far exceeds in what you could do if you were publishing, say, a Telnet connection raw to the internet. Trying to do clever, secure inspection of that Telnet connection is much harder than simply taking an off-the-shelf web proxy that can do security on that as well. And something I would like to add on this diagram, this is just going naked through, as it were, through public infrastructure. These web calls, they might be encrypted, but they are pretty much straightforward, secure calls. You can tunnel that across a VPN as well. So you can have your users VPNing to the edge of your connection, and all the encryption, certificates, authentication, etc., authorization to access that VPN can be there. And then your secure WebSocket or HTTPS connection with all its certificates can be going across that secure VPN. And again, Chris mentioned earlier that you can have whitelists and blacklists, so you can control perhaps which regions of the world can access your system, or a subset of IPs for maybe for remote offices or remote branches. So you can really, really secure Flynet Viewer end to end, both from the point of encryption, but validating that you're connecting to the right people and the right hosts, and the authentication and authorization to be able to access that system in the first place. So I'll pass back to you then, Chris.
Thank you very much, Mark. I'll move us to, I was going to reshare this. It seems slightly aimless. It's a slide that says questions. I'll pop it up, but it may have little value unless.
Well, we have a few actually, Chris. We've got a couple here. So, have you got any material I can share with my organization to make sure they are aware of this risk? Hello?
Yep, absolutely. Sorry, are you still hearing us, Sam?
Yeah, loud and clear.
Is it? Yeah, so we absolutely do. And I believe that in the follow-up, the guys from marketing who put this event on will be distributing material to further support some of the things we talked about today, some best practice information, and a couple of more detailed informational documents.
Cool. You mentioned these APT groups. If these people are able to get inside our network and obtain legitimate credentials, how can we know when they're accessing our system?
That's a great question, actually, because like I said to you, those APT groups, they just sit there. You know, they've got their inside your network, just gathering, sniffing, building buckets of information that they'll take back at a later date and exploit with heinous outcomes. Yeah. So interestingly, I'm not quite sure how broad a set of emulators do this, but I know Flynet can do this. Flynet has what's called the audit API, and we have banking customers that have used it to track abnormal. You weren't trained as a customer service, legitimately trained as a customer service agent on a banking system, your path through the system would probably be quite erroneous. We can track that and see that in real time, and we have actively been able to intercede and highlight and eliminate this type of behavior in real time. Similarly, we can also via the security and audit API look at particular fields maybe on a host. So we've got I'm thinking of a global insurer at the moment whereby it's kind of, you can imagine changing a start date on an insurance policy. You may have the authority to do it, but you would always want an audit trail of who did it and why. And we've been able to implement that solution there using the security and audit API. Again, looking for anomalous activity when you know what normal behavior looks like can be quite easily facilitated with Flynet's security and audit API. It's pretty good, actually.
Awesome. And then I think we've got one more. Is your solution FIPS 140 compliant?
Yep, -2, I think. Is it? Is probably what they're really asking, I would imagine. It's for the non-US folks on the phone. It's a much more US centric security standard, and yeah, we absolutely are FIPS 140-2 compliant. What I would say though is everyone says that they're FIPS 140-2 compliant, and that's because for that standard you only have to self-certify. So pretty much anyone can say it. They never get tested by, there's not a kind of a body that are testing for your honesty or integrity in that area. I would say, remember I talked about the red team activities. Always ask your vendor for proof of awareness and ask them how they test themselves, get tested by third parties, and how their application stands up to that external kind of attack or pen testing, as we kind of called it in the old days. Is it, or even ask them, like I said, about that coding standards, security aware coding standards like ISO 5055. Again, it's easy to self-certify against something. I can say in Flynet's case that they are certified, but what you're really looking for is credentials where external validation has been sought. And then, you know, looking at those ISO standards like 27001, make sure the organization you're dealing with is 27001, 9001 compliant, 5055 compliant. These are externally certified and validated certifications. And it's an ongoing thing. You don't just get it once. It's not just for Christmas. Every year you have to put effort into continuing to use and live at that standard.
Awesome. Great. Thanks very much for answering those, Chris.
Thank you very much indeed. Is there any more questions before we end this session? I will say this, guys, if you don't think of a question right now, if anyone's like me, my best questions come 30 minutes after the session finished. I always, I wish I thought of that at the time. In that case, please do just email that question straight into, or just respond with a question to probably the information you'll receive shortly after this session finishes, and we'll get that question answered for you. Okay, well, listen, thanks for giving up your time this afternoon, this morning, this evening, depending on where you were coming from. And hopefully we'll see you on a future session.